Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair, and after a brief hiatus, I am back. I was in Pakistan traveling, and then as Ishaq Dar was breaking the back of the dollar, my own back got broken. Not broken literally, but I was a bit sick, so we took some time off. But now I'm well and hoping to resume regular service of this podcast. And speaking of regular service, we have our regular guest, Khurram Husain, a dear friend of mine, business and economy journalist based out of Karachi. Most of you are, of course, familiar with him. He's been on the podcast before, frequently writes about economic developments in the country, and somebody who perhaps is one of the few people on the journalism side who's seen and observed very closely the frequent quote unquote boom bust cycles that we call, or the cycles of trying to control the dollar and stimulating growth, etc. So today we're going to be talking to Khurram about all that is going on in the Pakistan economy, starting with the return of Dar. Khurram, your dear friend from back in the day, is back in Pakistan, back in the finance ministry, and back trying to control the dollar. First of all, welcome to Pakistanomy, and then tell us, like, how does it feel to have Ishaq Dar back in the Q block and running the show once again?
It feels like I'm covering the same story over and over again for the past 15 years, whether it's Dar or somebody else. But with Dar coming back, there's a bit of a double whammy to all this, Uzair, because A, the face is the same, and B, the talk is the same. He's saying and doing the same things that he was saying and doing in his last stint, which ran from about 2013 till about 2017. So it's the same story over and over again. But there's one crucial difference this time round, and that crucial difference is that Pakistan is tapped out in terms of its debt capacity, how much we can borrow. There's a great deal of donor fatigue as well, because I think in Dar's first or his last stint, we began the whole business of supplementing IMF money with money taken from bilateral partners. So the borrowing from China and Saudi Arabia, if you remember in 2014, the first Saudi deposit, that's what they were calling it, a deposit from a friendly country, had come in. Of course, since then, they've gone back again and again and again, asking for more and more and more. But by now, either the Saudis are tapped out, the Chinese are tapped out, and the IMF is at the end of its patience with Pakistan, because, and we can talk about this, what all has been happening over the last 1.5 years between Pakistan and the IMF. So I think in terms of being able to do what he is setting out to do, he's going to find a significantly constrained space and room in which to support the dollar, to shore up the fiscal house, and at the same time combat inflation using state resources, because that's really what he's talking of doing. So my eyes are on this. How does he generate the resources that are required? And if he doesn't get those resources, will he have what it takes to realize the limits of his own power, to realize that this is it. This is as much as I can do. And if I were to press ahead, let's say in terms of selling dollars into the market in order to stabilize the exchange rate at a level that he wants it at, there's nothing wrong with stabilizing the exchange rate. The problem is when you try to determine the exchange rate and you try to, for example, in advance announce that it should be below 200 rupees to a dollar by this point in time. When he runs out of resources or runs short of resources, will he plow ahead and continue uh, to offload his resources in a vain attempt to try and reach his goal or to stay at his goal? Or will he realize that this is it? This is as far as I can take things. And from here on, if I were to continue doing what I'm doing, it will put the economy in significant amount of danger. And in order to get an answer to that question, I've looked at his own track record in the past, and then it occurred to me while doing that his track record is not that different from every other finance minister's track record for the past 20 years. None of them really realized the limits of their power, except perhaps for Hafiz Sheikh, whose only job was to come in and stabilize the economy and its deficits. And of course, more recently, Miftah. But other than that, we saw Shaukat Tareen, we've seen Shaukat Aziz before that, and of course, Ishaq Dar plowing ahead without acknowledging or without realizing the limits that they are breaching certain limits and thereby endangering the economy's viability. Um, and I'm just wondering whether Dar will repeat that story or not, because Pakistan is in no position to afford that kind of adventurism.
To me, the point that you made about being tapped out, right, is so important. But also, I would add to this the fact that, obviously the OPEC Plus has announced proposing a 2 million barrel a day, cut to production. So oil prices are back on the rebound. He, of course, cut 12 rupees in the petroleum prices over the last few days as well. So you have that impact. You have the war in Ukraine continuing, and futures prices, at least on the gas market in Europe, showing that the prices aren't going to ease. So you're expecting a colder than normal winter in Pakistan in terms of the availability of gas, and the fact that people won't have heat to keep warm. And of course, the cargoes aren't coming. And then on top of it, as if this wasn't enough, the Fed is basically continuing to signal that it is going to do whatever it takes to break the back of inflation, which means a more expensive dollar and more expensive access to the bond market. Um, do you sense that there is a recognition, at least among Dar? We know from Miftah, at least he understood those limitations, right? As you said, he's one of the rare finance ministers who sort of understood the limitations that were there inherent in the economy and the exogenous factors that added to those limitations. In these last few weeks or days since Dar has come back, have you sensed, at least from the PDM government or folks you've spoken to close to the government, that they recognize that this is not going to be an easy task in terms of their desire to stimulate growth and provide quote unquote relief into an election cycle for all these reasons that you and I follow and care about and continue writing and discussing?
Yeah, I mean, if there is a recognition, it's not coming through in their public pronouncements. There may well be a recognition of the fact that the international environment is right now nowhere near as permissive as it was in his last stint between 2013 and 2017. That was a time period when people were wondering that we've had such prolonged period of low interest rates in the advanced industrial economies, and yet it's not showing up in inflation. You remember those debates. And that basically allowed them to continue with very low interest rates indefinitely, or at least up until COVID. I mean, until our time now. Um, but and then other things too. Oil prices were crashing in those same years, and the debt capacity that Pakistan had was much larger than it is right now. Now, this time, I don't doubt that they realize it. I don't doubt that they have an idea that things are not as rosy for them this time round as they were back then. But to what extent do they actually grasp the extent of the problem? That's the real key question here. The thing is, there's severely limited room in which to operate, and you can see this, for example, in the kind of discounts on which Pakistan's Sukuk bond scheduled for maturity this December is selling. I mean, if the holders of Pakistan's external debt are asking themselves whether the December bond is a safe bet or not, and December is only a few months away, if they're asking themselves whether that is safe or not, so they are clearly sensing a much higher level of stress on the external sector than perhaps Dar Saab would be willing to admit right now. And those are people who don't make up their mind based on sentiment, right? I mean, the bond markets, global bond markets are not like stock markets here, where stampedes are created because one stockbroker said one thing or another. They usually come with very considered views, looking at your external financing requirements, looking at your foreign exchange reserves, and keeping a close eye on the fiscal framework and the numbers as they come out. So these are actually some pretty informed decisions that bond traders and bondholders are making to discount Pakistan's December maturity. I don't recall seeing this. I think maybe the last time would have been in 2008, but I forget right now whether there was a bond maturing in that particular fiscal year. That would be 2007-8. But there was a blowout on the euro bonds back then. This time, it's just unusual to see a blowout happening on a maturity that's coming due in a few months, and where you clearly do have the reserves at this point in time to meet that maturity. This is just one example that I'm using of the kind of limitations that he has. And the real question for me is, to what extent does he really understand the severity of the constraints that he will have to operate under in order to deliver what he has to? To my mind, he's come with an agenda to do about three, maybe four things. He has to keep the IMF program on track. On track. I think even he would realize that he cannot allow that program to go off track, because many of the other commitments being made for flood assistance, for debt relief that they are now going to start working on, would in all likelihood hinge on continuation of the IMF program. They obviously don't want a default by Pakistan as well, because that would impact the country's ability to import and export things, and an energy dependent country cannot really afford to go there, even marginally. And at the same time, I think his brief includes uh, minimizing or mitigating the impact of the burden of the adjustment measures on the electorate, on the voters, on the common citizenry of this country, to do more than what is possible to try and minimize the impact on the poor, on the middle classes, because these are the people from whom they will be asking for a vote within the next 12 months. Um, and at the same time, now he has added one more item to that list. I was surprised to see he's talking about reviving the economy, which goes beyond mitigating the impact of the adjustment on the poor. When you talk of reviving the economy, you're talking about shoring up business confidence. You're talking about freeing up corporate balance sheets from all the other expenses that have encroached upon them, in order to free up the resources they need to get their wheels of the economy moving. And he's talking about lowering interest rates, bringing down the exchange rate. We've got a monetary policy committee meeting coming up in the next few days. I think that's on Monday, just a few days away. We'll have, I suppose, our first real world test of Dar's actual intentions and how far he's going. I found it instructive to note that among the first meetings that he held after taking oath, the first one was with the FPR. So he's clearly getting a sense of the revenue position and where things are going on that front. And the second was with the state bank, and he had the state bank governor sitting next to him in a televised in a public setting. And the state bank governor is saying that yes, the state bank will do whatever we can to help support the government's goal of reviving the economy. I wonder if he himself realizes what he's signing up for over here. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question one more time, I think there would be a realization that the space is limited, but I think the extent to which it is limited, I think over there they probably have not fully appreciated how tight the situation really is.
Yeah, the readout from that meeting with the governor, to me, what stood out was their talk on coordination of fiscal and monetary policy to stimulate growth. And my own alarm bells went off when that quote came out, because I was like, the state bank A is already running negative real rates. It obviously still is behind the curve in terms of what's happening. They've been doing OMOs to provide liquidity into the market because everybody realizes this cannot go on forever. And on top of it, now you have a finance minister sitting with the governor, making these pronouncements, and then also openly, as you said, saying he not only wants to stimulate growth, he wants lower interest rates and a stronger currency, all while being part of the IMF program in an external environment that, as we've talked about, is not conducive to stimulating growth because it creates all sorts of risks. And I am just like, are you just trying to create the illusion of stability and growth into elections so that whatever happens after the election, somebody else has to deal with somebody probably, if you succeed in your wish, will be you yourself, aka Mr. Dar, because then you're expecting to come back to power. So I just don't, from the outside, understand what they're trying to do. And even on that debt moratorium and restructuring conversation, yes, the floods have been devastating. Yes, Pakistan will need support and dollar flows. But if you're seeking those flows and at the same time making the argument that I want a stronger currency with a track record of doing what he has done, I don't know how assured bilateral and multilateral donors are to provide that dollar, even if there was no fatigue, to a finance minister that is trying to do hanky panky, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Pakistan's creditors are watching these same signs that you and I are discussing very, very carefully, very closely. In my own conversations with them, that's the impression that I've gotten, that these things are being watched very carefully. Um, I think a lot hinges on, again, the extent to which he needs to go. Now, we know that he's not likely to let up on this thrust of his to revive the economy and at the same time to mitigate the burden on the poor and the middle classes as well. I mean, his constituency or the constituency that his party will be asking for a vote is quite large. And they can't really go into that election
Yeah, I mean, sorry to
having.
interrupt you on this. Like this argument that we need to lower petroleum prices to provide relief to the poor who have been impacted by floods, on surface level sounds okay, but you scratch a bit deeper, rings a bit hollow to me, because those that have been devastated by the floods are not on motorbikes or cars anymore. They need cash handouts and food and medicines and things like that. And the cut to the prices actually is for the middle and upper classes who actually have motorcycles and automobiles and things like that and care for it. Yes, you could argue that higher oil prices translated in inflation, food security, blah blah blah, but that's not the direct argument that's being made in this instance.
No, I think that argument is just being made for purposes of, I think, just like putting on a public face, trying to use the floods or leverage the floods as a means to persuade the creditors to loosen the terms. But as you pointed out, I think the creditors are themselves going to be watching his own policies. And I think quite obviously they will ask that if we give you this space, what do you plan to do with it? And if he can credibly show them that his intention is to help the flood victims, that the rescheduling that he's asking for may well be forthcoming. But if the demand for rescheduling is accompanied by uh, talk of reviving the economy, then I don't think so. I don't think anyone in the world wants to really contribute to reviving Pakistan's economy. I think they would be more than glad to help out in terms of flood relief and rehabilitation and reconstruction. I think any number of creditors who would be glad to assist in that process. We're seeing that already. The ADB has stepped forward. The World Bank has been reasonably fast in terms of reprogramming resources already committed for other projects towards flood relief instead. So some amount of funding has already begun to arrive. Uzair, my feeling is, and here I'm just sort of giving you an idea of how I think things might work out, is that they will A, leverage the floods to the extent that they can, and B, they will leverage or at least count very significantly on this idea that Pakistan is too big to fail. This has happened regularly. It's a regular feature in our history. And eventually they'll say, well, we're just going to go ahead and do what we're doing. Let's let the country approach the edge of default, and let's see if they're willing to just stand by and let us go over the edge. Um, It's not a good bet to be making for a finance minister. But I'm increasingly entertaining the idea that he's willing to go there, Dar, because the political compulsion behind him right now, let's not underestimate it. You have a government with a very embattled mandate, a very short distance to go before they have to face the electorate. And any government under these circumstances would find it very, very difficult to undertake the kind of stabilization measures that are there in the IMF program. So the compulsions are very, very strong, and I think they will reach for whatever they can in order to pursue them and put off the adjustment for as long as they possibly can. And in fact, their horizon would be until the next election, and then we'll come around to the stabilization part after that. I'm just hoping that the resources exist to for them to do this without really landing up in a catastrophic default of some sort.
I don't know how you're viewing what's happened over the last couple of weeks, at least in Washington, where I am seated. Obviously, Tony Blinken made the comment that, in terms of debt restructuring, etc., Pakistan should look to China as well,
Yeah.
because China owns 30% of Pakistan's bilateral credit, both commercial and bilateral
Also
combined.
loved how that was just sort of thrown in there,
Yeah.
the China part. Right? He's talking about all the Pak, China, the diaspora, their relationship, and just sort of threw this in there and then continued talking about it. It was very interesting how it was done. Clearly, that
To
was a
and
very, very intentional move.
That was intentional, and I think they've also on the DC side done something super interesting as well, which right after the trip, after Bilal Bhutto was done with his meetings, the United States announced the debt relief of $132 million worth of bilateral loans that were there. Right. So this was the initial announcement in person with Secretary Blinken, Bilal, that was made, was 10 million additional dollars. That takes the total amount of flood relief to over 60 million or 65 million, and then 132 million in terms of payments that were coming due and they've been pushed out. That was the announcement that was made. And so to me, it's like almost the United States has said, if you're going to make the argument of too big to fail and floods and etc., then we actually have done our bit, which is roughly 150 plus $1 million cumulatively. Close to 200 million by the end of the year is my guess that they'll go to directly as the United States. And then if you want more, well, go to Beijing and have that conversation and see what you can get, because then we'll think about other stuff, right? I don't know how you're seeing this, but I think they're also in the US at least seem to be preempting this too big to fail argument that we need relief, saying, okay, we're not actually the senior sort of majority stakeholders of your debt profile anymore. So we'll do a little bit here immediately, and then you got to go to Beijing and see what the Chinese offer you.
Right. Right. And the thing that I noted in in that episode was the sharp reaction that this drew from the Chinese side. And I think it was the next day or the day after, but within days, the Chinese side shot back themselves, saying that, well, if America wants to help Pakistan, they should do more to step up with the immediate relief. And they pointed to all the plane loads of aid they have sent and whatnot. Of course, for the Pakistani government, the immediate relief and the aid, plane loads of aid, the 100 million, $150 million is fine, but that's not really what they're there to talk about, right? They're talking about the multi-billion-dollar debt relief that they are looking for. Now, here's the interesting thing that I'm finding, and this is another new ingredient that has happened. It's got me a bit worried. Um, about maybe seven, up until 2014, when we got into this business of taking cash loans from bilateral partners and calling it a reserve extension facility, calling it a deposit from a friendly country, whatever name you want to give it, it's basically cash loan that you are taking from a bilateral partner. We got into this game back in 2014 or so. Prior to that, whenever Pakistan needed a debt relief, for example, in 2001, they went to the Paris Club. There was one window, one place where you had to go, and you got, provided that the call had come in, the fix was in beforehand, which in 2001 it was, 2002 actually, in the wake of 9/11. That was one of the aid packages, that a part of the aid package that was extended to Pakistan.
Which, by the way,
Um,
to the younger listeners, when people say Musharraf ke din bade achhe the, this was the driver. The initial driver was this restructuring of the Paris Club that brought in the achhe din of the Musharraf era.
oh, that opened up massive amounts of space for Musharraf, massive, bigger than I think anything enjoyed by Ayub Khan or Ziaul Haq. But in any case, you had to go to the IMF at that time in those days, and you had to go to the Paris Club, and it only rarely came to the Paris Club. There you'll find a couple of instances only where Pakistan is going there. Prior to that, they used to have what they called the Aid to Pakistan Consortium, where all bilateral creditors, multilateral creditors that Pakistan was dealing with were on one forum. This I'm talking over here like in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So you had again one place where you went to with your external sector difficulties and said, well, this is what we need. We need debt relief. We need an IMF loan. We need World Bank assistance and whatnot. And that one place, everything would be worked out, the Aid to Pakistan Consortium. But now uh, Pakistan has to go to seek a bailout, not only to the IMF, but separately to Saudi Arabia, to UAE, and to China. This time round, they added Qatar to the list as well. And so now what's happened is that the number of creditors involved in the bailouts that Pakistan now requires has grown. The amounts have grown. In fact, if you think about it, from about 2000 till now, if you look at the various boom bust cycles, every boom bust cycle is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Right, so we had about 4, maybe 5 years of a boom bust cycle in the Musharraf years. Let's say if it ran roughly from 2003 till about 2008, 2002 till 2007, you're talking 5 years at best, maybe four, but thereabouts. And plus its intensity, you hit a peak of 9% growth rate in 2004. The next one ran from roughly about 2014 till 2017. By 2018, Pakistan was back knocking at the doorstep of the IMF. And the latest one under Imran Khan barely ran about 18 months, from about June 2020 till about December 2021, when the emergency interest rate hikes, in my view, is the event that signals the end of that boom cycle and the arrival of the bust instead. So each cycle gets shorter and shorter and shorter. The size of the bailout required gets larger and larger and larger. And the number of creditors that you need to mobilize to put your bailout package together gets larger and larger and larger.
In fact, now the IMF calls the Saudis to say कि भाई आप पैसे दे रहे हैं कि नहीं, so that we can sign on the dotted line.
Exactly. So, now Pakistan is in a position where, in order to put together the latest of many such bailouts, they've got to first go to the Americans and ask them. The Americans say, well, talk to the Chinese first. The Chinese shoot back saying, well, the Americans should help out more with immediate aid first before sending people to us for debt relief. No, Chinese aren't particularly keen on giving anyone debt relief because, heck, we're only one country from our perspective, right? When you stand in Islamabad and look out, you see Beijing. But when you stand in Beijing and look out, you see what, about 60, 65, 70 countries? There was 82 that participated in that Belt and Road Initiative conference. So they've got a long line of people standing outside their door asking for debt relief. They've already declined to one party, which is Sri Lanka. Um, and now they're finding that the Americans are sending more and more people their way, saying, "Hey, you want debt relief? Sure, we'll give you debt relief. Go get it from the Chinese first." And soon somebody will say, "Well, get it from the Saudis too," and they're going to have to go and talk to the Saudis and tell them. And the Saudis aren't going to be any more patient with this than the Americans or the Chinese are. No, they're likely to say that, look, you came to us for one such deposit back in 2014. Then you were out, somebody else came in, and they started asking for more and more. The last one we just gave you was what, $2 billion? That was in December 2021. And every time you came back asking for one of these deposits from us, we would tell you that, look, you take this money, but make sure you do the right thing to ensure that you're not coming back. Don't just spend it all in one place. Don't consume the money in current consumption. Take the following steps. And you would say, yes, 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 we'll do all that. But for now, can we please have the money? And as soon as the money was released, you never did any of the things that we asked you to do. And today, you coming here asking us for debt relief. You didn't do a single one of the things that you were supposed to in order to put your own economy on a more sound footing. And now you're asking us for debt relief, saying that, well, we will work very hard to pay this off down the line. You made the same promises last time you came. You never kept them back then. What makes us believe that you will do now? But you can already see that the game is getting increasingly complex. It's getting larger and larger, and it's getting more and more complex because the more creditors that you have to speak with in order to arrange one of these bailout packages, the more complex the game becomes because they start hinging it on actions by another. They start saying, well, fine, if that guy agrees, then I'll agree. And you have to now deal not with one IMF in order to unlock all the multilateral funding or one Paris club in order to arrange all bilateral debt servicing, but in addition to these two, you've now got one, two, three world capitals to deal with: Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Beijing as well. And it's you know I'm just worried, and I get quite concerned when I look at this longer term trajectory and where we stand, because naturally you just extrapolate this out into the future, and you see where it's taking us. It's not to a good place. And then you have to ask, well, what will be required to deflect this trajectory off its present course onto something else, onto a better course than this one? And the mind begins to boggle at all that will be required to do that. So I wish I had a more positive, upbeat thing to say, but no, our country's in the drowning in floods and debt at the same time. And the global environment is turning very, very difficult in terms of energy pricing, interest rates. That I think Dar Saab has a pretty tough job cut out for him.
Yeah, no, we'll see how he does. And in fact, I was going to ask you this question towards the tail end, but I think we spent enough time on this topic to get to this question as well, which is I was in Pakistan, Karachi, and Islamabad, and met some folks. Obviously, keep an eye on the numbers, but also across the political spectrum, right? Especially in the PTI and the PMLN. And my read of this was that while there may be some recognition, as you said, internally, maybe they don't say it publicly, privately, they will hint at it that, yes, this is the problem. Well, when you ask them for the solution or what you said, what decisions have to be made to change that trajectory, right, that we're extrapolating and talking about, I at least don't get a read on a plan. So on the PMLN side, we clearly know Dar is the answer now. This is their last gasp pre-election maneuver to stay relevant in power somehow and not face the wrath of the electorate. On the PTI side, I asked a senior PTI member the same question. They were very confident that two-third majority is ours for the taking. And I said, well, we can debate that, but let's not, for the sake of argument, let's say that you actually get two-third majority tomorrow. You're in cabinet again. Well, what's your plan? And I kid you not, the response was that the initial few months that we need to spend is to control and manage the inflow and outflow of dollar. And overseas Pakistanis trust Imran Khan a lot. So when he's back as being prime minister, the inflow of dollars will start again because overseas Pakistanis will provide that money and we will stabilize the economy. To me, that was the plan that was communicated to me directly. And my alarm bells again went off saying there is no plan. And they said, Shaukat Tareen Saab is leading a committee, blah, blah, blah. We heard this back in the pre-2018 run-up as well with Asad Omar doing the same thing. Have you gotten a sense across the political spectrum of there being any plan in terms of what to do? Or is this is it?
This is it. This is it. I've gotten exactly the same signals you're talking about. The PTI people, when you ask them, fine, let's assume you get your two-thirds majority, what do you plan to do with it? You hear talk of RUDA, the real estate development scheme that they are launching, and Imran Khan himself keeps pointing to that as some kind of a motor force and motor engine of growth in his second term, in his second time round. And yes, overseas Pakistanis, I mean, in a sense, back to the dam fund. That and even over there, they haven't really done the detailed working required to get a sense of how much capacity there is among overseas Pakistanis to give. or to send remittances. They're just going by a very back of the envelope calculation that there are this many overseas Pakistanis. If each one gives $1,000, this is the amount we'll get. Let's assume we get 30% of what we are of this amount. Even then, it does so much.
Is
These
today's
kind.
Twitter math is how much gold do Pakistani women own and whether that is enough to pay out the debt owed by Pakistan.
Yes, I saw that, and that coming from the party's lead economic spokesman, right? That shows you that this is the level of the thinking in that camp. And in the PMLN camp, the level of the thinking doesn't really extend beyond surviving the next 1 year, preventing the economy from really going belly up, while at the same time mitigating the impact on you. Put off all important decisions. And I think where structural reform is concerned, fine, fair enough. You know, put it off. This is not the time to start, um, um, reforming the regulators or something. This is an extended interim government that we are living through. But even after, I mean, with them, the task is a bit easier because we've got one, two, three stints of theirs in the past to look back on and say, well, what kind of thinking have they revealed every time they've been in power? And mostly it's just project based. We'll build this project, we'll build. Yeah, in the last government, it was CPEC and the power plants, and the one before that, it was the motorway. No, the first one, it was the motorway. So it doesn't really go much beyond that. Big high visibility projects that they then brand as or present as infrastructure investments designed to remove the bottlenecks within the economy and thereby help the economy grow. We find out
Well,
later it's nothing
the
of the sort.
orange line, as much as I love public mass transit and the need for that in Pakistani cities, the fact that dollar denominated loans were taken for a metro line, not a bus line, a subway, not it's not a subway either, a
Yeah,
rail
yeah. It's
line,
an
a
elevated
urban
train.
elevated train line, where the money is subsidized, and of course mass transit is subsidized all over the world, but you're taking dollar denominated loans in a country that doesn't earn enough dollars to begin with, and somehow that's a measure of success. I have fundamental questions about whoever developed that strategy.
Yeah, I think it's easy enough to see that there would have been far more lower cost alternatives than the Orange Line elevated train at that time. But it looks a lot better, that elevated train. These are sort of big vanity projects that they enjoy pursuing. We haven't really seen a vision coming out of any of these parties to try and, let's say, what are you going to do regarding the depletion of your gas reserves? This is a long-term structural thing Pakistan is looking at for all time to come in our future. We are deep inside a situation now where our heavy reliance on natural gas, almost half of Pakistan's primary fuel needs are met with natural gas. And those reservoirs are declining at a rapid pace. It will be only a few years' time before imported LNG exceeds domestic gas in our system. But the costs that are coming with LNG are huge. You're already seeing the government sort of bargaining with the key stakeholders in the natural gas sector, such as the textile mill guys who run their captive power plants and then their boilers on it, who's saying that, well, if you don't subsidize this for us and sell it to us at $9 a unit, then we're not going to be viable anymore and our exports will come to a standstill. Fair enough. They may well be right. And we can take our positions on this debate. My concern is more, where are you going 5 years down the line on this? Because you can maybe eke out another year on subsidized LNG to shore up your exports. Maybe, lady, if luck smiles upon you, you leak out a second year, maybe even a third. But countries should not be living year to year like this. There needs to be some kind of thinking about what to do about the fact that our indigenous gas reserves are declining. How are we planning to keep energy costs in check as this process continues?
I would even make this a broader point on energy, right, Khurram, that And again, I moved to the United States in 2007, and I lived through that whole debate that happened here about energy security. And that debate and the fact that the United States, whether they should invest in shale energy, gas, and oil, sort of fracking technology, and all of that was a huge debate. But it was linked to energy security. And all of a sudden, America emerged as a net exporter of energy as a result of that strategy. Now, you can talk about the carbon emissions and you can talk about the environmental cost, blah blah blah, but the debate was energy security. I don't see any debate in Pakistan about what is the energy security strategy for a country that
Hmm.
supposedly talks about being a national security state. I'm like, without energy, how are you going to defend your own nation? Like, forget about everything else.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. That was my point in actually bringing this up, and this is just one example, Uzair, that that, and we can have a lengthy conversation on this alone. But you'll find, I find the same examples, let's say, on the tax to GDP side. How on earth do you intend to make a go of things with a tax to GDP ratio that doesn't really climb above 10% for very long? And when it does, it's 11, 12, 13%, and then falls back down again below that. That refuses to stay in the double digits for very long. And the losing competitive edge. We were a cotton-based exporter in the 1980s. We are still a cotton-based exporter, probably one of the few countries that never really diversified its export base in any meaningful way. Um, so, how do you intend to remain competitive and retain your ability to earn dollars, and support your national currency and your import requirements as you keep losing competitive edge in global markets? We could go on and on. I think you and I and our viewers will be quite familiar with this list. There's nothing. I don't really see anywhere in any of the parties and any real thinking taking place on this. And you can push people to come up with ideas, and they literally just sort of invent them then and there and say, well, we could do this, we could do that. But these are back of the envelope ideas, little notions. Um, some of them rather silly. I think looking to the dam fund was a pretty silly idea at the time, and I was surprised at the level of emotion that it evoked among people who were believers in it. But I've got a feeling that as time goes on and these deficiencies begin to bite, the temptation to turn to gimmicks of that sort will increase with it, and people thinking that they have some kind of a shortcut to get out of this situation.
In
But
these
sadly, we don't.
crises, yeah, and in these
Yeah,
crises, of course, vested interests, if you want to call them that, or whatever else, rent seekers or whatever, find ways to make money, right? So we had the longest ever real estate amnesty scheme with the argument that it'll
yes.
create jobs and generate growth and 40 allied industries, blah blah blah. Recently, we're seeing obviously another sort of, not one could call it a scandal. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this whole banks making money off of FX spreads, and the state bank supposed to investigate, and parliament looking into this, etc. um I have two questions on it. First of all, explain to the listeners what this whole debate is about, because it was part of the news cycle, but it's a very technical conversation. So I would love for you to explain to folks what happened. And then secondly, obviously, over the last few days, the rupee has been strengthening. And have you heard or seen or observed things that there are interventions going on, or what is the driver of this current strength of the rupee since Dar has come in? Would love your thoughts on both those things. So first, maybe let's talk about this FX spread scandal that is going on, and banks are supposedly making a ton of money off of it, and it being
Yeah.
investigated, and what happened here.
Yeah. What happened here was that the month of July saw extreme shortages of foreign exchange reserves in Pakistan, particularly dollars. The month of July is, I saw the tightest dollar situation that I've seen since 2007-8, somewhere around there. Um, and then when at the end of September, the banks run on a calendar year instead of the fiscal year. So when they filed their, and they're all listed entities, so they filed their results with the stock market at the stock exchange, and we went through those results. We stumbled across a little finding there, and we saw that the banks seem to have made very, very large profits on their foreign exchange operations in the in the second quarter of the fiscal year. I mean, of the calendar year. So that automatically, and we're talking outlandishly large, in some cases larger than the profits they made all last year, all of last calendar year. And they made more than that money in 3 months alone. Now, throughout the month of July, we were hearing from the business community that banks are taking advantage of the desperation of business entities. Somebody who had imported machinery, for example, from a Chinese supplier. The machinery landed at the port, and the bank said, sorry, we can't clear it without state bank approval. That approval was taking a long time to come. The banks kept saying, well, we don't have the dollars. And then when they did come back and say, okay, fine, we've arranged the funds. Now, mind you, you've imported the machinery, it's sitting at the port. Your supplier is saying, yo, where's my money? Um, and at that point, the bank started charging fees that were much larger than what they what they were in normal times. So we heard a lot of this. We heard like LCs being retired at 242 rupees to a dollar at a time when the exchange rate was, uh, if I remember correctly, closer to like 230 or less than 230 itself, and it left us all wondering that. And many people in the business community were raising this issue at that time, that these banks are profiteering from the shortages. When the results came out in September, it sort of seemed to confirm that impression and seemed to confirm what the business community had been saying. And then the state bank was summoned by the National Assembly, where the state bank officers went and said, well, we have served show cause notices, we're investigating. The National Assembly was told that there are 8 banks in particular who have been asked to explain transaction by transaction why they charged such high rates to retire an LC when funds were available, when they were buying funds from the market or borrowing funds from the market at rates far less than that. I mean, as that inquiry proceeds, I'll look forward to finding out more about what really happened. The bankers, when I speak to them, have their own point of view. They say that, look, we had to borrow from the forward market in order to arrange the funds necessary to retire these LCs. And why would an LC for an oil import, for example, be settled at 242 when the interbank rate is 232? Simple, because we had to borrow from the future at a loss, because the forward market itself was yielding negative premiums at that time. Now that gets a bit technical, but this is something we wrote about in Profit Magazine about negative premiums on the forward markets. This is something that happens whenever there are shortages of dollars in the markets, effectively meaning that banks are borrowing from forward markets at a loss in order to retire LCs that they have opened today. So bankers say, well, and we had no way to actually factor that into the exchange rate, because the exchange rate itself may well have been settled in advance at the time when the LC was opened. So we tacked it on as fees instead. But if we are to retire a customer's LC by borrowing at a loss from the forward market, then I'm sorry, say the bankers, that loss will have to be passed through to the customer. We aren't going to bear it. Now it becomes difficult at some point to figure out, who's in the right here. Were banks going too far, taking advantage of a vulnerable position? But I think the profits that they booked and they showed on their financial results seem to suggest that it was more than just making up for losses borrowing from the forward market. But anyways, I think as the state bank has the capacity to do these kind of inquiries, I look forward to finding out more, I think, as this proceeds about what's going on. But clearly, I think the banks are in some amount of trouble having to explain their position. It seems as if, yes, there was some amount of profiteering going on during the month of July, taking advantage of the dollar shortages to perhaps make a bit of a killing at the expense of their customers.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing similar things that you explained, and on either side, on the business side, the banks were gouging them. That was the allegation, and the banks were like, we're going to the forward market. But again, if you are saying that 3 months of profits are more than the last year combined put together,
Yeah,
then
exactly.
that obviously
The,
there's
I
a
mean,
question to be asked here.
that it turned out to be a pretty lucrative enterprise for them. But maybe they'll have another explanation. We'll see. They'll be given an opportunity to furnish their explanation. But right now, it's not looking good for them. I
Yeah.
mean, outlandishly large. We're not just saying slightly larger. We're looking at it much, much, much larger than the profits they made in the full calendar year of 2021 were booked in the second quarter of calendar year 2022 alone. So I think there's some amount of explaining that needs to be done there.
And so on the same note, on the FX side, we've seen the strength in the rupee recently. Obviously, the dollar remains strong globally, and even the UK is finding out that it's not that easy to run a larger than expected fiscal deficit and get away with it, so to speak. And they felt it. Liz Truss's government is under the pump because of that. What's driving the current strength of the rupee in Pakistan at this point? Obviously, there is the Dar effect, and we've talked about this. But I at least have not come across any credible stories or anything about interventions, etc. Although the state bank's reserves continue to slide, and last I checked, I think the 1.2 billion that came from the IMF is pretty much gone, or about to be gone. So, from your point of view, like, what are you hearing? What's driving the strength of the rupee? Is it just market-based dynamics, or something else is going on here?
Now, I'm hearing two things are driving this strength of the rupee. It's hard to attach weightage and say which one is driving it how much. But one, there is clearly interventions, and they've been continuing throughout August. And one place where you can look to get a glimpse is the forward cover position that the state bank releases in their balance sheet. Now, sadly, they don't release this as per a predetermined calendar, so they release this data whenever they feel like it. So we get large gaps between one release and another. But the latest release that has come out, when if you look at the forward cover position, what you'll notice is that it tends to go negative when Pakistan is not on an IMF program, and it becomes positive every time Pakistan is on an IMF program. And I've actually done this exercise. You can repeat it for the past, let's say, 2 years. Just look at the months when Pakistan was not in an IMF program, and suddenly the forward cover position goes negative. That suggests or it implies intervention. It implies that the state bank is liquidating some of its positions, arranging for dollars, and then finding ways to put those dollars into the government, into the bank's hand, not through direct sale in the interbank market. That's far too crude a mechanism in our time, but using forward swaps as a means to put more dollars into their hands. So the latest data that came out about a few days back showed that through August, this entire position was negative, had gone negative, and it tends to do that, and that suggests um, intervention. I'm saying suggests because there can be other ways, other reasons why it's going negative, but it's again highly suspicious that it goes negative only when when the fund program is non-operative. But whenever it is operative, the position suddenly spikes back up into positive territory. The other thing, so there is some intervention going on quite clearly. Anecdotally, I have heard as well from people I speak to familiar with treasury operations, involved in treasury operations, and we even know the mechanisms. Few favored banks um, manage to get some dollars from the state bank, and they are the ones who then offload into the interbank market. And it usually happens when the rupee begins to hit certain triggers. um, this is a more subtle way of intervening in the market then, and it doesn't leave a trace. It leaves off some suggestions that this sort of thing is going on, without leaving a trace behind in terms of the way active selling of dollars in the interbank market would. But the other thing is actually more interesting, which is Dar doing what he did back in January to March 2014. He's shouting down the dollar. And what that basically means is, if you remember in December 2013, he started coming on TV saying he wants to see the rupee back at 98. Said, I don't like the rupee where it's currently sitting. Bring it down to 98 for me. And throughout Jan and Feb, he kept saying that this needs to come down. This must, and he gave lectures before the exporter bodies, asking them, why aren't you guys bringing your dollars back? Why are you keeping your net open positions open for so long? Um, and eventually, in March 2014, there was a dive in the value of the dollar. So the rupee appreciated very rapidly with the arrival of the Saudi deposit that was announced very suddenly. But in those days, they hadn't sold a single one of those dollars into the market. The dollar fell against the rupee simply on word that it seems like Dar Saab has the resources with which to deliver on his threat. And I think something similar is happening now. The rupee began to fall, rise against the dollar, right as word was confirmed that Dar Saab is returning. And when Dar returned on Monday, that was, we saw a very sharp drop. I forget the exact amount, but it was a very sharp drop in the value of the dollar and the both open and curb market. And much of this was exporters placing their bet that the dollar has now, that the exchange rate has bottomed out and or the dollar has peaked. And it's time to bring this money back because from here onwards, the rupee is only going to appreciate further and further. And if you bring your dollars later, it will fetch fewer rupees than it would right now. So, exporters keep their dollars abroad. They have the right to keep them. I think it's 60 days. Um, Keeps changing. It used to be 180 days. They've changed it to 90, but it's something like that. Now, they choose the best time to bring it back and they wait to make the call on the exchange rate when they feel that it is bottomed out and they will get the maximum rupee for their dollar. That's when they usually close their positions. The fact that they all began closing these positions on the day Dar landed, that helped drive the exchange rate quite a bit. As per my conversations with Treasury people, between 50 to $100 million were brought back in by exporters closing their open positions on that Monday when Dar landed back in Pakistan and then went to take oath and all that. Between then and now, it's just been continuous. They're closing their position. They're bringing it back, saying that okay, it's peaked. Time to bring it back. Otherwise, you'll book losses. So it's a combination of these two things right now. It's certainly not market dynamics. The supply of dollars has not increased in the market because, as you also just pointed out, the foreign exchange reserves are clearly showing a decline. And at the same time, the demand for dollars from the import side has fallen to some extent, but nowhere near to the extent that it needs to in order to offset the supply and demand or the underlying market fundamentals. So yeah, we have a combination of sentiment and intervention, in my view, primarily driving the exchange rate these days.
And I think it will be interesting to see in the next cycle now what exporters do when Mr. Dar tries to shout them down, when they also notice that oil is back above 90. If
Yeah,
it stays above 90, the import bill is rising, etc., etc. So will be interesting to see. I think maybe this might be the last gasp of Daronomics, as we know and call it in Pakistan. But I think we touched upon this earlier on in our discussion as well, that and I agree with you that there does not seem to be any holistic plan, that the cycles are getting shorter, the peaks are getting lower, and Pakistan seems tapped out. And the too big to fail argument perhaps is the last gasp measure that folks have, that they're going to make in terms of getting more money from multilateral and bilateral creditors and donors, which I think you agree with me on this is no way to run a country and an economy of 230 plus million
yeah,
people. And
seriously,
it's a
yeah.
shame that this is what we've basically come down to in terms of the policy conversation and the policy landscape in Pakistan, because there is a lot more to do than just figure this out. But this seems to be the status quo mentality at this point in Pakistan, especially in Islamabad, I would say, of people saying, aise hi chalega. And you've seen this, I've seen this in the media, that there is a big segment of journalists and media men, media anchors who are sort of in the Dar camp, who think somehow Dar has a magic wand that he can figure these things out, and it's not going to end nicely for the country. And one just hopes that people realize that sooner rather than later, but doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon.
Mm, I agree. But in defense of my brethren in the media profession, I'll just go back to an earlier thing that I said. Let's also not underestimate the power of the political compulsions that would lie behind the finance minister to do what he's doing at a time like this. It would be an extraordinarily brave person to stand up to those compulsions. And I think that's one of the reasons why Miftah Ismail drew some applause from a very small but an important quarter, which is basically economists and people such as yourself as well, who follow Pakistan's economy carefully. Because I think a lot of people understood that he's had to really take a very, very difficult political stand in order to, that he's had to navigate the trade-offs between growth and stabilization, which are very, very strong, very powerful. And the fact that he managed to do it even for a few months, that's not bad. But obviously, we needed to, and Pakistan needed to balance these trade-offs for a lot longer than a few months. Um, Now we've gone back, but the political compulsions are powerful, and I think that's what my brethren in the media industry, who are putting their trust and faith perhaps in Dar, or at least or seeing things from his point of view, are acknowledging. They say, if you speak privately to these people, they'll say, look, you're absolutely right in what you are saying. But being an elected politician, being not even unelect, but being any kind of a leader in this country, it is very, very, very difficult to go to an inflation-saddled population and tell them, look, we got to raise another 5 rupees on petrol and diesel because there's an IMF program, there are fiscal targets. It's incredibly difficult to do. No one has been figured out, no one has been able to figure out how to do this right, how to do this in a way where you get the job done and you help people understand why you had to get the job done, because you're saving the country from default by effectively pushing tens of millions of its poor and lower middle class people into default.
Yeah, and I
Right.
agree, and I think that that political compulsion is something we do and should continue talking about. But I would also push back as the last point on this before we conclude as well, Khurram, and maybe you disagree on this. But we hear the same argument in terms of political compulsions when we say the taxpayer gives 17.5 billion a year to elite segment society. This is the UNDP saying
Yes.
this. You
No,
say,
I
well,
don't disagree at
political
all with you there.
compulsions, we can't do that. You say tax
Yes.
real estate, political compulsion, can't do that. Tax retail, political compulsion. So if everything is a political compulsion and the leader is not brave enough to shake up the status quo in a country where clearly the economy is not working, I mean, then perhaps they should not be in the business of leading because clearly they're failing at it.
No, agreed 100%.
Yeah. So on that
Agreed
note,
100% with that.
on that note and on that bombshell, thank you so much again for taking out the time. We'll have you on again soon. And as elections near, I think let's keep an eye out on how this restructuring and relief conversation goes. I don't think it will go in the way that people expect it to go, but for the sake of Pakistan and its millions of citizens, I hope that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. And as our friend Shuja Nawaz Saab says, hope that that light is not another train coming down your way. So
Let's hope so.
let's hope for that and hope for the best. And thank you again so much for taking out the time.
Thanks for having me. All the best.